Mr. Speaker, I rise to pay honor and tribute to the Honorable Dr. Martin Luther King. And Mr. Speaker, I am so proud and honored to have the preeminent privilege of doing so here in the well of the Congress. Mr. Speaker, Dr. King was born at a time, to quote Dr. Benjamin Hooks, when he could buy a hat, but he couldn't try it on. Born at a time when he could only sit in the balcony of a movie, and that was in some movies. There were others that he wasn't allowed in at all. Born at a time when he had to sit in the back of the bus or might be barred from riding the bus totally. Born at a time when he would have to wait in line and others of a different hue could always stand in front of him. Born at a time when invidious discrimination, when segregation was apparent and lawful. Dr. King was born at a time when there were few who were willing to challenge the hate and the bigotry that was emanating from this country in all of its arenas, for the most part. But Dr. King was a person who understood that which you will tolerate, you will not change. Dr. King refused to tolerate bigotry and hatred. He refused to tolerate it, and in fact, that is what separated him from a good many other people for the most part. Dr. King, if I may recall, went to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And when he went there to do something about the conditions, about the discrimination, about the hate and the bigotry, when he went there to do something about it, there were people who were tolerating hatred and bigotry. There were people there who were very prominent members of the clergy, 8 of them, who decided that they would write Dr. King a letter and explain to him that what he was doing was unwise and untimely. They explained to him that law and order should prevail. They commended the constabulary for protecting the city. These were persons who were considered honorable people, but they were people who were willing to tolerate hatred and bigotry. They, in fact, insisted that we should let the courts handle this. Let's work it through peaceful means by which we might sit and negotiate with those who would perpetrate hatred and bigotry. Dr. King, on the other hand, sought to use nonviolent protest as a methodology by which change might take place. The things that he could not tolerate, he was willing to protest to bring about change. There were other great orators of the time. Dr. King was indeed a great orator, one of the greatest ever. But there were other great orators. There were other persons who were knowledgeable, had PhDs, who were very well versed in what was happening with discrimination and could have spoken up on it, and many did speak up. But many of them were willing to tolerate it. Dr. King was not. And that separated him from a good many people who were orators, who were learned, who understood invidious discrimination. In fact, they were opposed to it, but they tolerated it in quiet ways. So when Dr. King went to Birmingham, these 8 clergy persons, having written him a letter, he found himself incarcerated in a Birmingham jail. He decided to respond to them. The letter from the Birmingham jail is a response to 8 clergy members, notable clergy members in Birmingham. So he decided to respond to their letter. And in responding to their letter, he gives us this masterpiece that really addresses what invidious discrimination is all about and why you can't consider yourself an outside agitator if you are an American. Why you have to do this not only for yourself but for the generations to come. But reading Dr. King's letter, as masterful as it is not enough. So today, in honor of his birthday, January 15th, I'm asking people to read the letter that Dr. King was responding to. If you read that letter, you will understand why you cannot tolerate hate. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.